Well, hello everybody and welcome to the first ever episode of Rappin with ReefBum, a live talk show on YouTube. I am your host, Keith Berkelhamer, and during each show, I will interview guests from the reef keeping community. Today I welcome Randy Donowitz, a reef keeping buddy of mine I have known for many years. Randy is one of the organizers of the Manhattan Reefs Frag swaps held in New York City, in that area. And he also generates content online primarily for Reefs Magazine under the Reefs.com banner. Additionally, Randy is the main caretaker of a number of reef tanks at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, New York. Randy, welcome to the show.
Hey Keith, how you doing? Glad to be here.
Yeah. So we're gonna talk about the whole situation in terms of what you're dealing with COVID-19. You're really in the middle of one of the biggest hotspots in the world right now with the coronavirus going on. So we're gonna go ahead.
I said that sadly that's true. For those that don't know, I'm here in Brooklyn, New York, so doesn't get much more of a hotspot than this.
Right. So we're gonna talk about that, but I kind of want to start with a few questions in terms of your background in the hobby, how you got into it, and then talk about what you're currently doing for Manhattan Reefs and Reefs .com. So let's start, Randy, with how you got into the hobby. How did you get into this crazy reef keeping hobby of ours?
It's a somewhat interesting story. I mean, it's kind of typical in some ways and very not typical in others. I always had fish tanks as a kid. It was just, the 10-gallon freshwater tank as a, third grader or whatnot. And I always kept little tanks when I was younger. When I graduated from college and I moved back to New York, actually, I decided I wanted to set up a couple of tanks in my apartment. And I can't even remember exactly how, but I started getting involved with keeping Tanganyikan cichlids, African cichlids. And I think for a lot of saltwater hobbyists and reef keepers, African cichlids are sort of the gateway drug. So I, for a number of years, probably 7 or 8 years, I was very heavily keeping and breeding Tanganyikan cichlids in my one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn. I had about 15 tanks, and I was doing all kinds of stuff. My cousin was into it. So that's kind of when I got heavily involved as a hobbyist in the aquarium hobby. I'd never kept marine fish or a saltwater tank at all. One always wanted to, but it was always hard. It was difficult, it was expensive, all the things you hear, and you still hear actually. One day I was at a local market, and there was actually a sign pinned to the bulletin board there. This was back in the days where that's how people communicated. You literally pinned a piece of paper up on a board with selling something or asking for something. And there was a guy who was offering to give away a saltwater system with anemones, all the filtration, everything, just needed it out. He was moving, and it turns out the guy lived literally right around the corner from my house. So I felt if ever there was an opportunity to try it, this was the opportunity, because at least it may still be difficult, but it wouldn't be expensive. So I contacted the guy and we set it up, and that was my first saltwater tank. This was probably 1994, I believe. Right around that time, or shortly after that, I took a position, which is still my current position, at Pratt Institute, which is an art and design college in Brooklyn. And unbeknownst to me, two faculty members who were at Pratt at that time happened to be actual seminal figures in the marine aquarium hobby. Terry Siegel, who many of you might know, he is the most of you probably know him as the founder of Advanced Aquarist Magazine. Before that, it was Aquarium Frontiers, and even way before that, Marine Aquarist Magazine is one of the first saltwater magazines in the country, actually. That goes way back to the late 70s, early 80s, I believe. Anyway, he was a professor here at Pratt, and I just coincidentally started working here and met him and his running buddy, Doug Robbins. And I literally went from knowing very little and knowing no one in the marine hobby to kind of knowing everyone within a couple of months, because Terry knew literally everybody. So I had a very, very, very steep learning curve. I had access to all the latest information almost instantaneously, and that sort of put me on a path to writing for the magazines and becoming, to use the word, an advanced aquarist really very rapidly compared to the learning curve of most people.
And so how did you also get involved with Reefs.com? Is that an offshoot of the magazine?
Well, Manhattan Reefs came first. Manhattan Reefs, for those who don't know, is kind of the online New York tri-state area local hobbyist community. It's kind of hard to have traditional clubs in New York City. It's hard to get people to turn out. It's hard to hold meetings and whatnot. So I didn't found Manhattan Reefs, but Josh Saul and the other few members who did figured, this goes back to the early 2000s, 2002 maybe, I think it was founded. And there was a desire to create an online community where people could meet and discuss and interact with each other, but not necessarily have to all congregate in a location on Friday nights at 9 p.m. like most clubs do or whatever, that kind of thing. So that was the original conception. I came to that community a few years later, 2004, I think. So I had met a local hobbyist at a shop who told me about it, and I was kind of not so attuned to what was going on online. It all seemed very strange to me at the time. And I kind of joined and started making friends and meeting people, and they started doing these small little frag swaps, really tiny ones at the time, 20, 30, 40 person frag swaps where they could find a place to hold them. And during that time, I had started bringing aquariums into my place of work on the campus, in my office. For those who don't know, I'm the director of the campus writing center there. It has nothing to do with aquariums, but I was able to bring aquariums into the office. And because it's a big open space, I was able to convince people at Pratt to let me hold a small frag swap actually in the writing center at Pratt. And this was the first frag swap that we actually held at Pratt Institute, was actually in my office. And I think we'll probably talk more about it later, but that has grown quite a bit since then. Yeah.
So Randy, we have a question from Tristan's Reef. He is asking, do you feel that some editorial organizations are afraid to write about certain topics, cost of products, competition, naming corals, wholesalers selling to customers undercutting LFS in shops?
Yes, absolutely. Publications are very skittish about writing about many of those things for various reasons. There's liability issues, which you wouldn't think maybe as a small publication in the aquarium hobby. People have been sued. We haven't been, but people have been sued for things. People think anything you say negative about somebody is all of a sudden an offense. I think a lot of publications do think long and hard about what they publish and how they contextualize what they publish. In terms of product reviews, I'd like to think at least we at Reefs.com try to be fair and honest and don't only say positive things about things if there are other things to be said. By the same token, I don't think we go out of our way to trash anybody either. If there's something we're really unhappy with, we would probably just not run the piece. I think that's probably what we would do.
Fair enough. So Randy, let's talk about the tanks at Pratt Reef. And I shot some video the last time I was there, which was the fall Manhattan Frag swaps. I think it was in November of 2019, right? And
Yep.
So yeah, go ahead and talk about each of the tanks, and I could show some video while you're talking.
Okay. So over the years, as I said, I was able to start to bring aquariums into my space. It's an art and design college. Students obviously have a pretty attuned aesthetic sense, and aquariums seemed like a sort of natural fit. And we also had this legacy, as I talked about, with Terry Siegel and Doug Robbins there. So I figured, let me try bringing in a few aquariums and see how it went. And students loved it.
I'm showing the Pratt Reef right now.
Okay, so that's the main reef tank, 240-gallon tank, 8 by 2 by 2, I believe is the dimensions. And that is what we call Pratt Reef. It's sort of known that way. It's a predominantly SPS tank, though it's mixed reef. There's a bunch of other stuff in it, a lot of fish too. That tank was set up originally in 2006, I believe, 2005 maybe. That one's an interesting one in that there was a slightly smaller tank there for a few years. It was an acrylic tank, and it had gotten very, very scratched up. I had a lot of students that helped me with the tanks, work study students. So not everybody's as meticulous as you might be with your home aquarium, which is fine for the purposes that I have the tank there for. But the tank was getting kind of scratched up and pretty crappy looking. And a couple of the core members of Manhattan Reefs who came to see it said, you know what, this is unacceptable. And they actually put out a call on Manhattan Reefs for contributions from the community to buy me a new tank. And they actually, within less than a week, they rounded up enough funds to buy me a brand spanking new tank, and that's what that tank is. And we did it as kind of a community build. I had about 10 or 15 people from the Manhattan Reefs community help me set up the tank, do the plumbing, do the aquascaping, and the build. And I've sort of always viewed it, while it is my tank, it is the campus's tank, I've always sort of viewed it as the community's tank at the same time.
Yeah, no, it's a beautiful tank. All right, so now let's talk about your newest tank, the water box.
Yeah, just maybe almost a year old, I guess. I got a water box 130, which I decided I wanted to set up kind of a tank dedicated to SPS, Acropora, basically. So it's a tank that's the first time I've ever set up a tank without a sand bed. It's the first time I've ever used completely dried rock to set up a tank. And it's been a little bit of a challenge to get it up and going. So what I like to say is the old reef that you just saw, the Pratt Reef, is a very old tank that's suffering from challenges of being a very old tank. And this water box is a very new tank that's suffering from the challenges of being a very new tank.
Yeah, I have never done a bare bottom tank, and I heard those certainly can be a little bit more challenging in terms of building up that biological filtration. And yeah, it's tough because I've always used live sand just because it can, help seed that nitrifying bacteria and promote that
Yep.
growth. And, it's always been, in terms of the old school reef keeping, a lot of live rock, a lot of live sand, and over the years it's kind of progressed in terms of a lot less rock and bare bottom. So that's an avenue that people have been going.
That's right. So my experience and my mindset is to the former, as you said, more live rock, live sand. And this is, you got to reorient the way you think about things. And it's definitely been a bit of a learning curve for me. This tank has struggled a little bit. We've had some dinoflagellates, which I think you struggled with at one point as well, which is no fun at all. Lost some of the early corals that I put in, and various other kinds of just like things not settling down as quickly as I'm used to them settling down. But I think we've gotten over the hump now, and things are kind of stable at the moment.
What are you using for extra biological filtration, or are you using anything in particular in the sump? Any?
I put a few extra pieces of rock in the sump. That's basically it.
All right, let's talk about your softy tank now. This is a really cool tank.
Oh, that's a Cobalt. It's a 40-gallon, I believe. It's an all-in-one tank, and it's basically, I wanted to try to showcase some different organisms and highlight some more easier to care for organisms. I have enough difficult stuff, so I wanted to set up another tank that was aesthetically pleasing and easy. So it's basically dedicated to soft corals, Simularia, Sarcophyton, and mushroom anemones. Pretty much that's all that's in that tank, and it requires virtually no care whatsoever. I feed the fish.
Yeah, no, it's a really neat tank, and it's a tank that, geez, I would love to try to keep one of those things. It just seems like it's a very low maintenance tank, which is a good thing in reef keeping when you have multiple tanks.
Absolutely true.
But I think probably the most fascinating tank to me is the anemone tank that you guys have there, and I'm showing some video of that thing with the clownfish harem, and that is just, well, go ahead and Randy, explain exactly the history on that tank.
Okay, that tank, that was probably one of the oldest tanks in the office. I forget exactly what date that was set up, but that tank's been, the contents of that tank have been around for about 15 years or so. The original anemone is an anemone that was given to me by Greg Scheimer, a seminal New York area hobbyist, author for many of the publications from back in the day, who unfortunately passed away a number of years ago. But anyway, he disseminated those anemones throughout the New York tri-state area. Those of you who've ever been out to the Long Island Aquarium, Joe Aiullo's place out on Long Island, they have a large anemone tank, same exact anemones from the same exact source. So all the anemones that you see are actually clones of one original one that was given to me years and years and years and years ago, and it's cloned itself a zillion times. I've given away 4 times as many as you currently see over the years. And again, that's a tank that is almost zero maintenance. The clownfish you see are all bred by Sanjay Joshi. Those are more recent additions. But I basically do nothing to that tank. I run some carbon on it, maybe once every 4 or 5 months I'll do a water change, no supplementation, I just feed the fish, top off water.
So Marcin Smock, and I might be mispronouncing this, is watching. He says the new anemone tank with a clownfish harem is absolutely beautiful.
Thank you, Marcin. You've seen it in person many times.
So Randy, now let's talk about the reality of your situation, which is you are located in the epicenter of the COVID-19 epidemic here, and you have tanks that are not in your house. So you need to go and visit Pratt Institute to take care of this tank. How are you managing that? Okay,
it's actually been a major challenge. Most people I see online when they're talking about this unfortunate situation more online say, well, at least I get to play with my tank all day. I'm exactly the opposite. I, in normal times, get to be with and fool around with my tanks all day because they're in my office. But now the situation is reversed, and it's actually been quite a challenge. Pratt is closed, as pretty much all universities are. I have been designated as essential which means that I am allowed to go to campus and I am allowed to care for the tanks. I live a block away from campus, so that is not a problem. But safety is an issue. So I'm not the youngest guy in the world. My 90-year-old dad lives with us. So keeping our family safe is a priority. And in order to keep my family safe, it has to actually limit how much I go out and about. So while I have access to my tanks, I'm trying to go in as infrequently as possible, which causes, as you might imagine, lots of challenges and stress on the systems. I have so many systems. They've been running in my office where I'm there 5 days a week, a block away, so I can go in on weekends, that I never really set up much automation on them because there really wasn't a need. I'm not much of an equipment guy. I never really depended on a lot of equipment. I've always had work study students to pick up the slack when I go on vacation and whatnot. All of a sudden, none of that's available to me. So I had to quickly buy some automation equipment. I bought some Tunzi osmolators for auto top off on the larger systems, some auto feeders that I've set up. And I do get in there 2 or 3 days a week, and one of my staff members does come in another day. But we're limited in how much time we have, and we're limited what we can do. And probably the biggest challenge is top-off water. It's a lot of tanks. There's more tanks than the ones you talked about. Having enough water on hand and continually available is one of the biggest challenges we have, actually. The idea of doing water changes is almost impossible right now, and the corals are starting to suffer for it, frankly.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how's everything kind of holding up right now?
Well, the big reef, Pratt Reef, was kind of on a downward spiral of its own due to age and various other issues. So that one has continued to spiral down. So what I've done actually is, from a coral point of view, I've decided to focus my attention on the water box. And I've moved pretty much all the acros that were healthy out of the bigger reef into the water box, focusing on trying to maintain that one as best I can. In the big reef, the Gonopora, the leathers, the Fabias, those kinds of things are still doing fine. They don't require as much babying and care, so we'll see how long we can keep those going. But quite honestly, I'm at the point where in the big reef, it's keeping the fish alive is the most important thing to me right now. It's kind of easier to replace corals because I know people like you.
Well, I could certainly hook you up there, Randy, if you need some corals down the line there. But hopefully you don't need to get restocked totally there.
Yeah. So so in that big tank, it's keep what I can alive, keep the fish alive, which so far has been very possible. The water box, try to get the acros cranking, which seems to be working at this point in time. The anemone tank's not a problem. That little that cobalt softy tank is not a problem. In the interim, I had just set up, before this all hit, a new freshwater planet tank.
Oh, wow.
A 100-gallon freshwater planet tank, which is actually very beautiful right now, and is also seems to be pretty easy to take care of. So that one I'm not too worried about. And there's various other little aquariums around, and a whole bunch of students who had to vacate campus in an emergency left me their betas.
Oh,
so
jeez.
a whole cohort of betas to care for also. So, I think keeping the fish populations going is not that problematic. The corals are a problem.
Right. Any advice for anybody else trying to keep things alive remotely? I mean, anything you could say at this point to folks? It's difficult.
Yeah, automate what you can. If you have limited time, if you have access and limited time, you got to be strategic about how you use your time. Having a good supply of water on hand is really important. Make sure you have salt, so you can maybe sneak in a couple of water changes, or you have it for an emergency if you need to. Automatic feeders are really, really cheap and a good way to keep your system going. I did just get my hands on a doser, so I will be dosing the water box 2-part, which should help keep those corals going a little better. Usually I just manually add 2-part. I'm really old school that way. That's kind of the way I've done it, but when I'm in my office every day, it's not a problem. Now it's a problem.
Yeah, and who could foresee this problem happening?
No one. Well, Maybe some people,
maybe,
but that's another
that's a whole
story.
other topic. So Randy, let's jump back a little bit and
Yeah.
take a broader view
Yeah.
of the hobby here. What I mean, we've you talked about in terms of way back when Manhattan Reefs started to have small frag swaps, and then the online thing started to develop. But aside from the online world, what are some of the biggest changes that you've seen in the hobby over the years that you've been in it? Any trends that stand out to you?
Well, yeah, I mean, if we're going to go way back, obviously, the internet changed everything in terms of access to information, both good and bad. And from a person who creates content for the hobby, written content, people don't want to read anymore. And that's like a real problem. I try and hope to produce quality, in-depth content in written form, but that means pages of reading. And we found fewer and fewer people who are actually interested in doing the reading. It's easier to get a simple answer to your question by asking it on some group on Facebook or on some forum, and getting an answer that you can maybe be confident in or maybe not. So that has changed a lot.
Yeah, I mean, if I could interject, I think that's also it could also be problematic, right? Because if you go to reef discussion boards to try to find out answers for some particular problems, there is some bad information out there. I mean, you got to take certain advice with a grain of salt, and
for
so
sure.
that's certainly been a change, and I think you've got to be smart in terms of sifting through the right information.
Yeah, it's really hard for beginners or sort of fairly new to the hobby folks to really sift through it. There's so much information out there, and so much of it is not really reliable or is anecdotal at best. So if you can figure out, kind of like we always used to do, even when it was just like you're new and you joined a club, you kind of meet somebody who you think knows what they're talking about, and you've seen their tank and it looks good, and they talk intelligently and cogently and consistently about stuff. You kind of latch on to them. You can do the same thing online when you go to these boards. You can, if you read with a discerning eye and ear, you can kind of figure out who knows what they're talking about.
Yeah.
And there's always going to be disagreements about things. That's kind of always the way it is. There's many different ways to be successful, and there's many different ways to fail in this hobby. But I think finding
mentors. You're talking about mentors.
Yeah, mentors.
I remember when I first got into the hobby, I frequented a couple of shops, local fish stores in Connecticut, and there was one guy. Do you remember Chris Jensen? Jessen?
Sure.
Yep.
Jessen. Sure. Yeah.
He had this beautiful SPS reef tank. It was an in-wall. It might have been a 120-gallon tank, and I just kind of latched on to him. And
he knew his stuff.
He knew his stuff, and I think this was really before all the discussion boards became popular, and before Reef Central was all the rage. I remember being in there one day, and a couple other hobbyists said to me, "Are you on Reef Central?" I was like, "What's that?"
Right.
So I think finding a mentor in the hobby is certainly a very important thing, and I think local fish stores are very important in that process, and I think frag swaps, you meet a lot of people, and you can talk to a lot of folks at the swaps, vendors, and people that propagate corals. So there is a lot of information out there, and reading has become a lost art. But it is important still to stay connected, with those types of publications, whether it's your publication or it's some of the older books out there. That's I still have several books in my library from Julian Sprung, and those are
can't beat a good book. You can't beat a good book. It doesn't mean there's not old, outdated, or not great information in some books too, but it's vetted a lot more carefully than what you'll find online.
So on an equipment basis, what do you think are some of the biggest innovations recently on the equipment front? If you had to kind of point your finger at something that's made life easier for reef keepers.
Obviously, LED light has changed the game for a lot of people. Again, controversy, is it as good as metal halide or T5s or whatnot? We can have those debates always. We've always had those debates before LEDs. What's the best light? What's the best spectrum, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is LEDs have kind of dominated the market, and it's pretty much proven at this time that any number of high quality LEDs can grow corals just fine.
Yeah, I haven't made the jump yet. I am still using metal halide lighting, but
you're still using halides.
I am. Yeah, the tank that I'm showing the loop on right now, my 187 gallon tank is metal halides, but I'm definitely open to trying LEDs.
Right. Well, I mean, there's no doubt that metal halides work.
Yeah.
I mean, they're fantastic. But I personally, I hated changing bulbs all the time and having them in stock, and I really enjoy not having to use a chiller in the summer. To me, that's the biggest thing.
Those are good reasons. So we have a question.
I think that,
go ahead, Randy.
No, question's fine. I was just going to go on with some.
From Mayor Reef, what is the key to fast coral growth? What type of light and everything else, et cetera? So I think you already answered part of that question with the LEDs, but what would you say are other keys to fast growth with SPS and other corals?
Stable parameters, regular routine. Alkalinity is probably the most important parameter to keep your eyes on. I think you could, most people, when you test alkalinity, they also test calcium. I think you could really go for a pretty long time without testing your calcium, and you'll be okay as long as your alkalinity is in line. Stability, having a routine. This is, and people have different routines, but they stick to a routine, and whatever's working, stick to the routine. And I think that's probably the most important thing. I'm not a big guy on magic potions. I don't dose a whole lot of stuff to my tanks generally. I've experimented with some stuff, and generally whenever I start experimenting with that kind of stuff, things go wrong. So
yeah, no, I always
it's just my experience. I know other people have plenty of positive things to say about that kind of stuff.
I always say to folks that the simpler the system, the better. I think it's just a lot less moving parts, a lot less variables in play, and I like to keep things with my reef tanks as easy as possible. I think it also makes it easier in terms of maintenance. Yeah,
I agree. And this is kind of a very old school thing to say, but I think it has some credence, and this is a difference in the hobby now. The equipment and the products and the sort of understanding of the science behind our reefs has gotten a lot better. But people now tend to rely on sort of formulas for success, as opposed to really developing sort of an intimate sort of relationship with their reef, like really looking and really sort of being in tune with what their animals are telling them. And that's kind of an old school way of kind of feeling your way through it, but I think there's a lot of merit and a lot of actual pleasure, actually, in being that in touch with your tank. If you've had a system for a while, you can kind of tell there are different animals that react differently to different things, and if you're aware of them, you can tell when something's going a little off, and you can take action just by looking carefully and being aware.
I totally agree with that philosophy.
Yeah.
So let me.
Chasing numbers is bad. I think there are no magic numbers.
So what are your opinions of like the Trident and the soon to be released Ion Director from GHL in terms of automated alkalinity, calcium, magnesium, and monitoring and.
I mean, I've never used them, so I can't speak from a user point of view. I think they're very exciting developments, and I think they're wonderful additions to the sort of toolbox of what can be achieved. I kind of wish I had them now in my current situation. They'd come in handy in my circumstance at the moment. Again, I think those are very useful tools, but they're tools. They're not the whole game. I mean, you need to, like any other tool, you need to know how to use the tool properly, and that one tool is part of a much larger toolkit. And so, again, those kinds of tools, I think, are super valuable, but they also tend to get people to chase numbers, which I think is kind of not necessarily a good thing all the time.
Yep. All right, so I got a series of some rapid fire questions for you. You ready? Yep. Favorite fish of all time?
Wow, that is tough.
If you had to pick one fish.
If I had to pick one, probably a Hawaiian flame wrasse.
Oh, nice. Yeah, okay. Favorite SPS coral?
Pearlberry, old school.
Love it. That's one of my favorites too. Favorite LPS coral?
Don't have an answer for you. I like them. I just don't have.
Yeah, you don't have a favorite.
Yeah.
What would be the most important piece of equipment to have a backup of?
The toss up between lights and a return pump.
Gotcha. All right, and final question here. A dream tank, how big and what type? Or do you already have your dream tank?
I kind of have my dream tank. I mean, you know, my 240 is pretty close to perfect. I wish it was a little deeper front to back. So 8 feet long is good for me. 10, I could probably learn to love 10 feet long too. But I think 2 feet front to back's a little too narrow. The current sighting of my tank wouldn't allow for anything any deeper because there's a way that people need to walk past it. But if I could get that out to 30 or 36, that would sort of be perfect for me. So 10 by 36 and maybe 2 feet deep would be, sounds pretty ideal.
I tell you, width is really important. I have, so my 225 gallon tank, which was 6 foot long and 2 foot tall, was 30 inches wide. And I love that width. And then my current 187 gallon tank is 5 foot by 30 by 24. So again, I really find that the extra width on a tank opens up a lot in terms of aquascaping, which is really cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll go the reverse too. I really enjoy some really small nano tanks. I think they're really, really interesting.
Yep.
You kind of look at them in a very different way. You kind of notice the small things much more obviously. But
yep, I hear you. So Randy, I don't know if we have any other questions. Any final thoughts? I'd really appreciate you doing the show here during these very trying times.
Thank you. My pleasure to be here. I don't know. I think it's great that you're doing these. I think you know, some old salts like us need to start doing these kinds of videos and sort of you know, giving people a glimpse to how the hobby progressed. I think there's a lot of people that don't really know the history of the hobby all that well.
Yep.
And it actually has changed quite a bit. We could talk about that some more either now or at some other point. But there's been a lot of changes, both good and bad.
For sure. No, I tell you, this hobby really keeps you on your toes. It's like when you think you finally got something down, you get another curveball thrown at you, and it's humbling at times. It really is.
Right. What does Joe Ayula always say? It's like a grand chess match that you're destined to lose eventually.
That's a great quote. All right, well, listen, Randy, thank you so much for being a guest, and be safe out there, and I'll keep my fingers crossed for the tanks, and you let me know if you ever need anything to help replenish those tanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Good luck with everything. Stay safe out there, everybody.
All righty. Hey, folks, thanks a lot for tuning in. I'm definitely looking forward to having more of these shows and more guests, so stay tuned in the future for future Rappin' with ReefBum live broadcast. Have a good night. Adios.